Hey everyone, welcome to the Zeitgeist on A Mighty Blaze. I'm your host, Jane Roper. On the Zeitgeist, I talk with authors whose books touch on topics like race, class, gender, health, history. Wait, no, not history. Yes, history, science, and whatever else sounds fascinating and conversation worthy. We air on Thursdays at 4 p.m. If you want to know about what's coming up next, both here on the Zeitgeist, got a whole bunch, one every day of the week except Monday. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also go to our website, amightyblaze.com, and sign up for our newsletter and get the scoop delivered to your inbox every Monday. So welcome and happy Thursday. My guest today is Kathleen Courtenay Stone. Kathleen is the author of They Called Us Girls, Stories of Female Ambition from Suffrage to Mad Men. Kathleen studied art history at Oberlin College and holds a JD from Boston University School of Law and an MFA from Bennington College. As a lawyer, she was a law clerk to a federal district court judge, a litigation partner in a law firm, senior counsel in a financial institution, and a solo practitioner. After many years of practicing law and writing countless legal briefs, she turned to other sorts of writing. Her reviews of recent books and art exhibitions have been published in Plowshares and Arts Views. Other work has appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Pangyris. Is it Pangyris or Pangyris? Pangyris.
I think Pangyris.
Okay, we'll go with Pangyris. The Timberline Review, the Writer and the Writer's Chronicle. She also co-hosts Book Lab, a wonderful literary salon that I had the privilege of visiting many years back. Kathleen and her husband live in a brick row house in Boston and a converted bait shack on a dock in Mid-Coast, Maine. They Called Us Girls, which you can see behind you on the wall there. Beautiful. Oh, I have a copy too. I should be holding that up, is a collective biography of 7 women who held professional jobs in mid-20th century America, the 40s, 50s, and 60s, in an era when middle-class women were expected to find fulfillment at home in the mold of television's June Cleaver. When women did have professional jobs, it was generally a secretaries, nurses, or teachers. But the women whose stories Kathleen shares in her book broke the mold, defying expectations to succeed in jobs reserved almost exclusively for men as doctor, lawyer, artist, physicist, executive director, and spy, aka intelligence officer, I guess is what we're supposed to say. But I like saying spy because it's more exciting. So welcome, Kathleen. We're so happy to have you here on the Zeitgeist.
Thank you, Jane, for having me. It's a real thrill.
So this book, this wonderful book, is a project that you worked on over many years. Is that right?
It certainly is.
Yeah. So tell me about the story of how this book came to be. Where did the idea for it come from?
Well, in a way, it started when I was really very young. In fact, I write about that in the introduction. I picture myself as I was about 8 years old. I'm sitting on the floor of the living room looking at my father's books that I'm pulling off the bookshelf. And one of them is the yearbook from his class in law school. He graduated from law school in 1950. And I'm looking at the pictures, and it dawns on me that most of the pictures of the students are men, and there's only a handful of women. So that's one thing. But then I realized that the women who went to law school are not the women I know. My mother, when she was pregnant with me, actually left her job at IBM and became a stay-at-home mother. And all the women in my neighborhood essentially were stay-at-home mothers. So that's the environment in which I grew up. But I knew that there were a few other women who had done something different. And I was just fascinated and intrigued. And they were a real mystery to me. Who were these women and what made them do something that I knew even then was unusual? So in a sense, that's the beginning of the idea for the book. Mm-hmm. Not that I fixated on it throughout my whole life.
Right, sure.
I put it aside, went on with my own life. But then many years later, when I was practicing law myself, I realized that I was still sort of curious about those women who had done something so unconventional for their era. Mm-hmm. And I decided that if I wanted to find out why and where that ambition came from, I didn't have infinite time to figure that out. I needed to talk to some of these women while I could.
Right.
So I started interviewing women. And simultaneously doing research into women's history. And that's sort of how the book started to come together.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's such a fascinating time period. And you get into this a little bit in your book when you're explaining, with first wave feminism, right? You had suffrage and you had, this idea for the first time, like, hey, women can and should, if they want, go to college, enrollment in universities went up. Women started working outside the home a little more, but then it kind of plateaued, right? There wasn't that continued upward progress for women.
Yes. And that, when I was doing this sort of general research into women's history, primarily the 20th century, but when I came across that little factoid that for 50 years, from 1920 to 1970, the women made no progress in getting into male-dominated fields, that sort of a light bulb went off. And the women that I'm writing about were not the very first. It was not the first doctor, not the first lawyer, et cetera. So there were a few women in those kinds of male-dominated fields, but the rate of increase was flat for those 50 years.
Right.
And that, in a way, validated what I had suspected when I was 8 years old, looking at my father's yearbook. It sort of put it into a historical context and, as I said, validated, and it sort of gave me more historical impetus to go forward with the project.
Right.
And it also made me aware that the women that I was interested in talking to really were unusual, because they were among the few who had gone into those kinds of fields, even while at the same time more women were going into the workforce. They were just, other women were going into jobs that were considered appropriate for women.
Right. Secretaries and things, yeah.
Yeah, and by then, secretarial, nursing, and teaching, at least elementary school or lower grade teaching, was dominated by women.
Right.
I was looking for women who had gone into essentially taken men's jobs.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, and so your central question throughout the book is, what made these women different, right? What made them special and what drove them? And there certainly were some commonalities, and also they're a very diverse group. But I'd love you to talk a little bit about some of those commonalities and what was sort of part of the secret formula, right, that led to these women pursuing, these kinds of men's careers.
Yeah, it was really when I was writing the epilogue that some of these themes that I had been sort of working with, but almost in isolation for each woman, it came into a broader perspective for me. And one thing that it almost sounds pedestrian, and it's not surprising in a way, but it nonetheless, I think, is profound, is the importance of family. And by that, I don't mean that, as you say, these women were diverse in a number of ways, including socioeconomic class.
Yes.
These were not all families of great privilege.
Right.
For some of them grew up in poverty.
Right.
But nonetheless, all of them got something from their family that gave them that little extra oomph.
Yeah.
And often it was a belief in education, that girls should be educated as much as the boys.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing. In fact, one woman, Dr. Muriel Pettione, who's one of the 7 women I write about, she said something, and she was a physician and also worked in the public schools in New York City, in Harlem. And she worked with a lot of kids in her role in the schools. And she said that a child is lucky if they have someone who tells them they can do something great. And if it's a parent who says that, then the child is really lucky.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what I came to feel, is that all of these women grew up with great family influences.
Yeah. And for many of them, it was having a father that seemed not that mothers weren't important, they are, and you talk about that, but in several cases, it really seemed like it helped to have the dad on board too, to
Oh,
say,
absolutely. Yeah.
this women, it doesn't matter if you're a girl, like you should pursue a professional career. So there were sort of these kind of progressive fathers involved in many of these stories.
Yes, there definitely were. Although a couple of women didn't. One of them, her parents divorced when she was fairly young,
Right.
and she grew up without her father.
Yeah.
Another woman lost both of her parents at the end of World War II, and
right.
So she was a teenager without a father at all. So the fathers played different roles, but you're absolutely right that a couple of them had fathers who they followed their fathers into their careers, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
Both of the women who became doctors had fathers who were doctors.
Yes. Yes. And that's part of your story in a way too. I mean,
Yeah.
Your father was a lawyer. So,
yes.
And you wrote a lovely thing. Forgive me if I'm misquoting, but how, it helped you feel closer to him. You got to know him in a new way once you started practicing law as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. By the time I got to law school, we would have completely boring to anybody else, but to us, interesting conversations about tort law and stuff like that.
Right. Yep, sure. So one of the things that I found fascinating in reading, well, you know what? Let me back up a second. I'm going to hold off that thought. What I'd love to hear is how you found these women. How did you track them down? Like, what led you? I know there's a variety of explanations, but I'm really curious to know how you were introduced to them. Maybe not all of them, but yeah, some of the stories behind that.
Well, you're right. It was a variety. So when I started working on the book, I did a lot of research on women's history in general. And I was doing all this. Some of it was actually books, and some of it was on the internet. And on the internet, there's all kinds of lists about women who were in the forefront of various industries. So I found a couple of women in that kind of research. But what really was helpful to me was my personal network.
Right.
For instance, Rhea Zobel, who is a judge on the Federal District Court in Massachusetts. She was the first woman to go on that court back in 1979. And I think for at least 14 years, she was the only woman in the federal court in Massachusetts.
Right.
I knew I wanted to interview a lawyer, and a federal judge would be particularly an interesting lawyer to interview. But, you can't just walk into a federal judge's chambers and say, hi, I'm here to interview you. But one of my husband's colleagues had been Judge Zobel's law clerk when she had gotten out of law school. So I asked for an introduction, and she was kind enough to make that introduction.
Right.
So that was one way. I already mentioned Dr. Muriel Pettione in Harlem. I very much wanted to have some racial and ethnic diversity in the book. And I was at a conference, and I met someone and I told her what I was working on, and she said, oh, you really should interview this Black doctor in Harlem. And I didn't really know this woman, but she made a call for me and made an introduction, and then Dr. Pettione said she would see me. So it was things like that, of just people putting themselves forward to help me. That got me some introductions that I otherwise wouldn't have had.
Right. Yeah, it's fantastic because you do. It's such a diverse array of women in diverse fields and from different backgrounds as well. So, I think that's really one of the strengths. What makes the book so compelling, because saying before, okay, there's some commonalities, but it's also proof that it crossed all kinds of boundaries and crossed socioeconomic and racial boundaries. What compelled these different women? It's not as if it was just all upper middle class women who went to Smith College. So yeah, I think that was fascinating. Now, one thing that was notable was for several of not all of the women had children, but I don't think, right? There were a couple who didn't.
Correct.
Yeah,
couple of
but the ones who did, were not like they got good support, right? They had either outside help or help from within the family. They weren't doing the sort of having to do it all by themselves and have a career as well.
Right. The one woman who had children who didn't have outside help was Daliv Ipkar, who was an artist.
Right.
She and her husband lived on a small farm in rural Maine.
Yeah.
I don't think she had any outside help. But because they were both she and her husband were working at home, either on the
Right.
farm or she was in her art studio, they were able to
Yeah.
take care of things for themselves. But
Right.
the other women either had, I mean, they all had supportive partners.
Right.
I would say that. And they also had outside help.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because all of the husbands were working also. So
Mhm.
they all had childcare of some sort from outside.
Right. Right. So they were in circumstances that a lot of women, two working parent families are in today. And
Absolutely.
yeah, having that extra help is so crucial. Yeah, I mean, it really, the parallels are quite interesting. And what I thought was fascinating was the there were a number of times where the women's attitudes toward their situations came out, right? So I was just struck by, I didn't sense a ton of like outrage or anger or, there was a couple times where the women are like, well, that's the way it was. Like the men were sexist. Yeah. There were, I think it was with the Ryla, the lawyer. I'm getting her name wrong.
Rhea, R-Y-A, Rhea.
Right, Rhea. Okay. So I think she was the one who said that there was a day at law school that was like the ladies' day where like the women, the women would know that they'd actually get called on. And I guess the men had to shut up. And, some of the women were like, wait a minute, this is, causing, what's the word I'm looking for? Perpetuating sexism. And she was just like, hey, I just wanted to learn more. It was just a chance to learn more. But there were a number of things like that where it was like, it was so, like the sexism and the discrimination against, it was so the norm that it wasn't even like they were sort of, shocked or outraged by it. Whereas if those things happen now, or even if they had been happening, I think, post second wave feminism in the 70s and 80s, and there would have been more anger mixed up in there.
I think you're right. And I think that was something that was very notable about this generation of women. Maybe the fact that they were in law school at all was enough of a triumph that they weren't going to worry about whether they got to, how much they got to talk or not. But it would absolutely be an issue today. Also, I was interviewing these women when they were in their 80s and 90s. And so that it may be that just some of, if they had felt outrage, it had dissipated a little bit. I mean, that was that was way in the past.
Right, right.
Yeah. But I also think that, if you think about men of that generation, the so-called greatest generation, men who came back from the Second World War, didn't often talk a lot about their experiences in the war.
Right, right.
It was just sort of, that's what they had to do. And now they were, assuming they had come back, now they were back and going on with the rest of their lives. And so there was something in that generation that I think was less vocal about things that hadn't gone well, both for men and for women.
Yes. Yeah. There was a lot that was unsaid.
And I think it was Cordelia Hood, who was the so-called spy.
Yeah.
Because I asked her about how, when she had to interview a man to get information, what that was like. And she said she had to establish herself. And it was harder for her than it would be for a man to establish herself as the one with the authority to get the information, that she knew what she was talking about.
Right.
But she also said that, well, you just have to get over that male-female thing.
Yes.
Just pass right by it.
Right, right, right. Sure. Just get over it. Yeah. No, I mean, and yeah, I mean, I think there is that issue though of establishing authority is still very much an issue in some fields
Oh, yes.
for women today. I mean, it persists. Absolutely. I have a comment here, and it's too big to pop up on the screen, but I just want to read it to you from Liz Havens, who graduated mid-60s, and the opportunities for women in the work world were definitely limited. She says, in the 70s, I worked for a newspaper as a librarian and got to talking to a reporter who was doing a piece on women at work. She found it hard to believe that most of my female classmates were going into so-called women's fields for school/work. Thank you for clarifying this for the generations following mine. But I remember my mother saying that when she was in high school, I mean, it was really almost a standard thing. And so she graduated from high school in 65. And, the guidance counselor, it was like, well, do you want to be a nurse or a teacher? Or do you, a secretary? And, if you did, that sort of was, here's where you should go to school. Here's where you should go to school, whatever, and it was like, it wasn't even, nobody said, well, you're interested in like doing a law school, pre-law, are you interested in pre-med? Like here, it wasn't even discussed. I mean, it's like, it's just crazy to me that, that generation, even what seems like just on the cusp, whereas 10 years later, that might have been completely different, 10, 15 years later.
Well, right. And that's, at the end of this, we talked earlier about the 50-year plateau period from essentially 1920 to 1970. But by 1970, things really were starting to change. I mean, there was another big uptick in the women going to college, graduate school, and into professional fields.
Right.
It absolutely changed.
And that's when many of the traditionally all-male colleges actually became co-ed as well, coincided with that. So a couple questions here from Chris. Was there anyone you wished to include in the book but were unable to do so? I was going to ask that question too. Good one, Chris.
Thank you, Chris, for the question. If it were a longer book, or if I were going to do a sequel, which I don't think I would, but if I were, I'd love to have a woman who's in the military of that generation.
Yeah. Because there's certainly, certainly in the war, there were, in World War II, there were women who were in, who were serving in the military, though they're, a minority.
They were in, I think, generally in their own units.
Right.
And the women who stayed in and made the military a career often did so, and went up the ranks, often did so through the nursing ranks.
Right.
Not combat positions in that time anyway.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, that would have been an interesting environment to explore.
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
And I don't have any woman in politics from that era either. There were only a few, but that I don't have either.
Right. That would have been fascinating. So yeah, maybe you do need to do the sequel. Although I guess it's harder to find people you can interview live because so many of these women have passed on or are close to it. Now, I don't want to, I feel like this would be asking you to choose between your children, but do you have a favorite chapter, a favorite story in there, or one that that resonated the most with you among these women?
Yeah, it is like choosing among your children. But I would say that Cordelia Hood, the intelligence officer, was a family friend of ours. Yeah. So I knew her personally. In fact, and she was one of the, in a subtle way, she was part of the influence for getting me to do the book. Not because she ever spoke to me about it before I interviewed her, but knowing her, I admired her. She was a really cool, interesting person.
Right.
And she was so fascinating to me that it made me think, okay, I really do want to do this project of interviewing these women. So so in that sense, it's a little close to my heart that that particular chapter is in there because it was part of the instigation for the book.
Right. And it is it's a great chapter. It's a great story. I mean, they all are. I found, each one of the portraits were really fascinating and every woman's path was so different. But yeah, that one was, a bit more exotic than some of the others. in terms of your career, so you began your career as, what year did you go to law school again? Remind me.
I graduated from law school in 1980.
Right. Okay. So when you were exploring these women's stories, did it reframe or recast the way you thought about your own career development, or did you find a lot of parallels, points of commonality?
I did find some parallels. Obviously, they were of my mother's generation, so things had changed.
Right.
But I did, and in fact, I allude to some of it in what I call the intermezzos, the little mini
Yes.
chapters between the chapters about the women.
Yes, I'll quickly explain that those are little chapters where you insert bits of your own story, bits of sort of your own reflections and memoir and personal history, which are great because they really they show the connections. But sorry, go on.
Well, one of the connections a point of connection I wanted to allude to was one of the women, Dr. Martha Lee Powell, became a nationally known expert in pediatric infectious disease.
Mm-hmm.
But when she was in high school, she wasn't sure she should go to medical school, in part because she thought girls weren't supposed to be good in math. And she needed math for the science that she was going to be taking.
Right.
And I was in high school. My math teacher thought I should take calculus, and I decided not to take calculus because I thought it wasn't what girls were supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
So that prejudice or that very narrow way of thinking was still alive and well when I was in high school.
Right, right.
The fact I didn't take calculus probably didn't change the trajectory of the rest of my life.
Right, right.
But I wish I had done it.
Mm-hmm.
Just so that I could say, yes, I did that and I succeeded. And
Yeah.
I guess that's my takeaway from having learned about these women and written about them. As I reflect on all of the things they did and all the challenges they met,
yeah,
and succeeded in, it makes me wish that I had never backed down.
Yeah.
That I had taken that calculus course, or that I had done X, Y, or Z other things that maybe I avoided or I sidestepped. I didn't push myself.
Right. Yeah. So in observing sort of, younger generations of women, what do you see? I mean, I imagine when you were practicing law, you had younger women coming up and working under you, or what did you feel like had or hadn't changed? I'm curious, or even what do you feel like were the attitudes different that you saw among those women? Was there more taking it for granted? It was just sort of like, yeah, of course I'm here. Or is there still an awareness, do you feel like, among those barriers?
Oh, I think people are still aware of the barriers. I actually just did a book event for the Federal Bar Association.
Mm-hmm.
And so obviously it was all judges and lawyers in the room.
Sure.
And some of the younger women there they may not know all the history, but they definitely are aware of the remaining challenges.
Right.
Women are more, at least, or maybe a little bit more than 50% of the law students are women now.
More than 50. Oh, great. Yeah.
Well, it's about 50 or maybe 51, 52, something like that. But women are by and large not the managing partners of their firms. There are a few.
Right.
Right. And I think the younger women who I was talking to at the Federal Bar Association I think they would agree that partly it's, this whole notion of how you have a family and how you deal with the family.
Right.
And some of that it's going to have to be those battles, and they don't have to be battles, but those conversations have to be had at home on a one-on-one basis.
Yeah.
If the woman's career is important to her, then maybe she doesn't need to be the one who picks the kid up after school.
Right. Right.
Or at least does it only 2 days a week instead of 4 or 5 days a week, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And although it's changing, women still do. I mean, study after study shows that they, even when they are two career families, the woman still does more of the, stuff involving kids and stuff. I mean, and when they're babies, obviously that can be a biological thing.
Right.
But it persists. Women share more of take on more of the household burden. And yeah, I mean, I think there's this idea of having it all that, is certainly problematic, and that pressure that a lot of women feel. I think fewer women, in my generation and younger, I don't know. I don't know if it's quite the same pressure as what sort of the boomer generation, and well, you're like a young boomer, so but
But I am a boomer.
you are, yes, just technically, right, under the wire. But we're feeling, that second wave feminism brought along this having it all kind of attitude, and women are, people are pushing back against that now, and saying it's just not possible. It's just go nuts trying to do it. What do you hope young women now? So my Chris, who had a question earlier, was saying that she gave this book as a graduation gift to her niece. So what do you hope younger women who read this book take away from it?
Oh, I love the idea of it being a graduation gift for younger women. And I have a couple of friends who have daughters who are in around the age 30 and are really just in the beginning stages of what looks like very promising careers. But I think those young women who I have talked to actually were sort of surprised to have some of the history fleshed out for them. They didn't always know what things had been like. So,
Right.
and that's always interesting. I also think that I hope for them as well, it's an inspiration to meet the challenges head on.
Yeah.
If you want to. And I'm not saying that everybody has to be a slave at the office and forego out of the office pleasures or family or anything like that. But I think there's a real feeling of satisfaction that one can get by throwing oneself into a job that's interesting and makes you feel like you have a fully realized life, which is what I think it was for these women.
Yeah.
And I hope that younger generations find that similar kind of inspiration.
Yes, absolutely. So if anyone has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And as we had in a banner before, you can find the book at Bookends in Winchester. Also the Barnes & Noble at the Prudential Center. And you can also find it online, of course, anywhere books are sold online. If we have any questions, please feel free to throw them up there.
There's one other thing I was going to add.
Oh, yes, please.
To one of your earlier questions. You asked what was the secret behind these women's success. And of course, there's no one answer to that. And I talked about families, and that is absolutely true, even though these family configurations were really quite different, one from the next. But there was something else I was going to add, and this sort of relates to families, is that when I sat down to write the epilogue and try to pull some of these themes together, what I realized was that out of the 7 women, 3 were immigrants themselves and 3 were the daughters of immigrants.
Interesting.
And it made me really think about the importance of immigration. And in the sense that for them, immigration was a positive.
Right.
Coming to their families coming to this country represented opportunities that they didn't have in where they came from. Right. And in fact, I mentioned this at the federal bar event that I was at, and Judge Zobel was sitting right next to me. And as I said, she had grown up in Germany and left when she was 13 without any parents. And she said it wasn't just the feeling of opportunity ahead, but there was nothing for her. Germany was a devastated country.
Right.
She was 13, no food, no parents. So getting on a refugee ship was really the best possible answer for her.
Right. Right.
But I do think that there's something about families who come to this country with a feeling of optimism and possibility,
Mm-hmm.
and becomes part of the family story that's told, and that somehow was a positive influence for these women.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and it speaks to today when you hear about the success rates of immigrants in terms of you know the upward mobility of so many, not certainly not across the board, but the employment rates and the starting businesses and all and attainment of higher education. There really is, if you come here and feel like this is a place where there actually is opportunity, and that's really woven into your family and your values. It makes a lot of sense that that's
As flawed as some systems in this country may be,
yeah.
they are sometimes better than what existed for some immigrants in other countries.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. We have not a question but an observation, which I agree with. Kathleen, you have fantastic hair.
Why, thank you.
I absolutely agree. It really is fantastic. I was noticing that.
All right.
Yeah, hey. So
Hey, you want to go out for drinks, Chris?
yeah, right. She's my neighbor. She's right down the street.
Oh.
So I just want to speak aloud the names of each of these women, because I just want to make sure that everyone hears them, because they're also fascinating names, and also just to remind everyone who you will read about when you buy this book, which you will all do. But we have, you know what, I should have you say the names actually, because you're going to pronounce them better. So Dalaf
Ipcar. Yeah.
Ipcar, who's an artist, right? Okay. Then we have Muriel Pettioni, doctor. Mm-hmm. Cordelia Hood, intelligence officer. Martha Lee Powell, right?
Lee Powell, I think.
Lee Powell, physician. She was the one who helped with polio research. Mildred Spivak Dresselhaus.
Yep.
Dresselhaus, physicist. And she was, you said, the first fully tenured female professor at MIT.
She was.
Frida Garcia, nonprofit leader. And Raya Weichert Zobel, federal judge. Okay, so folks, get this book. Read about these fascinating women. It's really incredible, really inspiring. And yeah, thank you so much, Kathleen, for writing this book and for being here today to tell us about it.
Well, thanks, Jane. It's been fun talking to you.
All right. Well,